The biological purpose of the nervous system is absolute. It processes environmental inputs and dictates physical behaviors to optimize survival. Yet the exact same neurobiological hardware generates two wildly divergent outcomes. It produces both extreme physical discipline and destructive cycles of addiction. At its peak operational capacity, this circuitry compels an Olympic athlete to execute years of relentless, painful training to secure a distant objective. In a maladaptive state, this exact same circuitry compels an individual to sit stationary and compulsively scroll through algorithmic feeds for hours on end. Drive, motivation, and habit are strict mechanical outputs of basal brain architecture. They are biological processes, not measures of moral character. Deep in the brain, the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, connects to the nucleus accumbens. Sitting above this primitive engine is the regulatory brake system. The prefrontal cortex is the brain's executive control center, responsible for logic and future planning. These two systems are locked in a perpetual fight for control over the body's motor outputs. The basal structures demand immediate reward, while the cortex suppresses those impulses for long-term gain. Mastering human behavior requires a mechanical solution, strengthening the prefrontal cortex so it can consistently exert top-down inhibitory control over the primitive reward circuitry. The deep survival hardware responsible for desire and motivation has been evolutionarily conserved across nearly all mammalian species. Look at the surface of a human brain. It has a dense, highly folded structure, a classification known as gyrencephalic. Compare that to the brain of a rat. The topography is completely smooth, or lissencephalic. The human brain folds inward for a strictly mechanical reason. The rigid boundaries of the skull limit volume, forcing the tissue to wrinkle to compress an exponentially larger surface area into a confined space. This surface area consists of gray matter. These are the regions packed with cell bodies, the somas, where neural signals are actually generated. Beneath that sits the white matter. This consists of internal capsules and myelinated axons that act as biological cables, carrying the generated signals away from the cortex and down into the spinal cord to execute movement. While humans evolved a massive cortical surface area to process complex thought, the deep subcortical hardware generating our base desires remains functionally identical to that of a rodent. This animated cross-section and data plot track the chemical sequence of desire. When the brain detects environmental cues, the ventral tegmental area produces the neurotransmitter dopamine, pulsing it directly into the nucleus accumbens. This chemical transfer physically drives the animal to pursue a specific goal. On the plot, you can see the baseline for survival. Natural biological rewards like eating a meal or engaging in social interaction trigger modest dopamine spikes. This reinforces the behavior required to stay alive. Modern environments introduce a variable our biology never anticipated: hyperstimuli. These take the form of infinite algorithmic feeds, high-stakes gambling, and synthetic drugs. The chemical payload of these modern hyperstimuli dwarfs natural evolutionary rewards. They trigger artificial dopamine releases that completely shatter the biological baseline. Our ancient, conserved reward architecture cannot process infinite, on-demand digital stimuli without physically breaking down. Faced with a chronic flood of hyperstimuli, the brain initiates a physical defense mechanism. It actively alters the structure of its own cells, retracting and dissolving dopamine receptors away from the synaptic surface. Neuroscientists define this structural adaptation as downregulation. This line graph illustrates how downregulation shifts the mathematical baseline of the reward system. The minimum threshold required to feel satisfaction is physically elevated. Consequently, normal biological rewards like food or a standard conversation no longer register. The baseline has moved too high for natural dopamine spikes to reach it. The individual is now trapped in a neurochemical deficit. They require the extreme dopamine release of the hyperstimulus to reach a baseline state of normalcy. Compulsive habits and addictions are the mechanical result of a structural deficit, where the brain's reward threshold outpaces physical reality. The brain has a single biological defense mechanism against runaway subcortical drives, the prefrontal cortex. This diagram defines willpower as a physical action. Willpower is the mechanical capacity of the prefrontal cortex to transmit inhibitory signals downwards to override the impulses of the basal ganglia. Elite athletes serve as precise case studies in hyperdeveloped top-down cortical control. Olympic swimmers like Michael Phelps utilize intense, repetitive mental rehearsal to govern their physical output. The biology of visualization is concrete. Mentally rehearsing a race actively myelinates the procedural motor circuits in the striatum, strengthening the specific neural pathways long before physical movement occurs. This exact process of mental rehearsal also trains the prefrontal cortex to actively inhibit the amygdala. If an unexpected crisis happens, like swimming goggles breaking mid-race, the brain suppresses the biological fear response. Elite discipline is the mechanical outcome of a hypermyelinated prefrontal cortex successfully overriding the limbic system's panic and reward signals. For an average individual living in an environment of constant stimulation, the baseline is already shifted. How do you rebuild top-down control? The answer relies on neuroplasticity, the biological mechanism by which behavior physically alters brain architecture over time. Forcing the brain to undertake difficult, non-rewarding tasks, like learning a new language or mastering an instrument, acts as biological resistance training. Every instance of delaying gratification literally thickens the inhibitory pathways descending from the prefrontal cortex. Brain anatomy is never static. Every resisted urge is a deliberate architectural edit that upgrades your executive control network. Human behavior is a perpetual mechanical tug-of-war between subcortical drives seeking immediate reward and cortical inhibition demanding long-term strategy. This split-screen diagram contrasts a failing behavioral state with an optimized one. On the left, weak pathways fail to contain the pulse. On the right, thick, solid cortical pathways effectively cap and control the deep brain's chemical output. Maintaining this optimized architecture is a necessity for navigating a modern environment engineered to hijack our ancient survival systems. True autonomy is derived from the deliberate mechanical strengthening of the prefrontal cortex against the baseline demands of human biology.